Welcome to the Coffee with Karen podcast, a weekly chat show discussing everything from holistic health to current affairs from a mental, physical and spiritual perspective. Get your weekly cup of positivity with a sprinkling of woo-woo.
Welcome to a Coffee with Karen, cup of positivity with just a sprinkling of woo-woo. So every week, my guests will be discussing a variety of topics from either a mental, a physical, or a spiritual perspective, or actually any combination of those three. So myself, your host, is Karen Roberts, and yes, I focus on all three within my business. But today, I'm going to allow David to introduce himself. My guest today, I suppose, I would say you pretty much cover all perspectives, but if you can share with the listeners a little bit about who you are, what you do, and share a little bit of your story, David.
Sure. So I'm David. I'm a private bereavement counsellor, and I also treat people for depression and anxiety. I've been in practice for about 12 years. I have struggled with mental illness myself pretty much since I was 6 years old. And I also had a double bereavement when I was 25. I lost both my parents within a year of each other, which is 30 years ago next year. So my struggles kind of began, as I said, probably around primary school, where I went through a lot of bullying, both in primary and secondary. And I struggled a lot with feelings of isolation and depression and anxiety. And that kind of intensified as the years went on. And I think everything was kind of exacerbated by things that teachers would say to me. So they'd pull me aside and say that I looked alone, I looked isolated, I looked troubled. So all this kind of reaffirmed in my head that something wasn't quite right. And I don't know where it came from. I don't know how it all started. All I know is that I have memories of just feeling very alone as young as that age.
Wow. That's quite, that is, and in your work, is that quite unusual to have children so young already struggling like that?
It really is. And, mental illness is its own separate pandemic, if you like. And I have, children as young as 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old struggling with depression, anxiety, you name it. And it's absolutely rife amongst teenagers now. Absolutely rife, starting from 11, 12, 13, going right on through uni. And sadly, I think that the events of the last year and a half are going to absolutely fuel a new pandemic, which is going to be a mental illness pandemic.
Yes, I would sadly really agree with all that you've said. I've even had personal experience with my own children with different parts of that. And I'm sure that you've seen a huge difference with the before pre-COVID to, we're not post quite yet, are we? Which is a shame. However, for anybody that is having these feelings, there are solutions, right?
Yeah, and one thing that I'm always mindful of is that when I struggled from, say, the ages of 6, 7, 8, right through to, I still struggle today, but the difference is now I have tools and I have coping tools and I have strategies. But for the best part of 30, 35 years, I had no coping tools. So my heart goes out to people who are struggling but have no coping tools, you're literally in the wilderness. You're on your own with no help.
And are they aware? Were you, like you said, you sort of became aware when your own teachers pulled you aside and said things to you? So if they hadn't, were you actually aware?
Yeah, very much. I mean, I've got memories of even the first few days of school, you know, kind of hovering around the hallway whilst all the other kids were, you know, in their art class or this class or that class, and I would eventually go into class, but I was always on the outside. I was always isolated from groups of people, and that was a theme right through my teens and 20s, and even sort of going into 30s. I could be in a group of people but feel completely alone. So yeah, I was very aware that I was very connected to that sense of loneliness. Very connected. I was very
Right.
aware.
And would you describe yourself as an introvert or an extrovert?
Well, interestingly, I would say by nature I'm an introvert, but there are times where I can be extrovert.
Yep. Yeah. So there's varying degrees, isn't there? But the reason I asked that is only purely because very recently I had a guest on my show explaining the differences. And again, through personal experience, I have one daughter who's one and one daughter who's another, and seeing how they have navigated their way through what is going on right now. Do you think that could be part of it through the growing phase, through in school, because things aren't really geared towards a child that is introverted? They're always trying to be pushed to be an extrovert, and they might not be comfortable with that.
So there are many theories about what makes somebody, you know, struggle with depression, and what creates what makes somebody anxious. Is it circumstantial? Is it genetic? Is it clinical? You know, when you go to the doctor and you get a diagnosis, you can get a diagnosis for moderate depression. You can get a diagnosis for severe depression. You can get a diagnosis for mild depression. There's so many different tiers of and I would say that you can be an introvert without being depressed.
Yeah.
You can just like quiet time. You can just be of a quiet nature, and you don't necessarily have to have mental health struggles just because you're an introvert. What I would say is that from the people that I've treated, I would say that there's a combination of people who are clinically depressed. In other words, there's something biological that makes them struggle the way they do. There are people who have gone through trauma, and that will trigger mental illness. And there are people who experience a whole bunch of circumstances in their life that just eventually send them downhill, and they can't cope anymore, and that triggers anxiety, depression, trauma, etc. So there are a number of potential circumstances and factors that contribute towards mental illness. For some, it's a mixture of all of the above.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So for you, you say your struggles with mental illness started when you were age 6. So was there anything that actually triggered that at that time?
So I've got a lot of time for the whole genetic theory, and my grandfather struggled with depression, and we're very alike in many ways. He was very musical. He was very into music. I'm very into music. He was very into English. I'm very into English, so language, literature. So lots of similarities, but he struggled with intense depression. So I would say that my depression is 100% clinical, biological, but things that have happened in my life have exacerbated it. So the double bereavement exacerbated my depression. The bullying exacerbated my anxiety. So I would see that in terms of the age that my mental illness began, I would say that was 100% clinical, because nothing happened in my life to warrant feeling lonely and depressed. I had a functional, normal upbringing.
So how did you deal with the death of both your parents? And like I'm sure anybody listening, they could understand that, the absolute trauma that anybody would have gone through being left alone in the world. So how did you deal with that?
Well, I think because I was so young when it happened, and losing both parents at that kind of age, I kind of felt like an orphan. I kind of felt completely rudderless. And what's interesting with how different people grieve is it always boils down to the relationship you had with the person you've lost. So I was very close to my parents and respected my parents, and they were the world to me. So it was a very hard grieving process for obvious reasons. I was very lucky that I got into grief counselling very soon. So I did that for 2 years. Without that, I don't quite know how I would have navigated it. So, there was this feeling of the world's caved in, the rug's been pulled, total shock, total and utter surreal shock.
Yeah, absolutely. And is that so? I mean, for you, then for somebody who's gone through that trauma, and then you've gone on to become a counsellor yourself, was that? Did you know back then that you wanted to do that? Well, how did that come about? What made you want to become a counsellor yourself and specialising in bereavement?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that when you go through struggles in life, it gets to a point where you want to pay it forward and you want to reduce other people's suffering. And there are two reasons for that. First is that you don't want people to go through what you've gone through, but obviously they're going to a certain degree, but you want to arm them with tools and techniques to make their journey more bearable. The second reason is that when you think of the whole concept, when I heal others, I heal myself. And that's very much prevalent, that when you help somebody else, it gives you a sense of completeness, it gives you a sense of connection, makes you feel good about yourself. So it is a little bit selfish, but in a very positive way.
It absolutely, and I think there is very much a common theme there. I think the majority of people I've interviewed on this show, it does seem to be people have had their own issues, and they've, things have been changed. They've had some kind of transformation. And then, as you say, they want to then give back, and they want to help others that are going through similar situations that they've been through. It's quite a natural response, I think, to then want to help them. And like you say, I can understand then the flip side of that, as it actually, in doing that, it can still help yourself, because I would imagine going through something like that is that, it doesn't ever stop. But I suppose you focusing on helping others is going to have a knock-on effect. It's helping yourself, because you're reaffirming all those things that you're teaching into your subconscious, because we learn through repeated repetition, right?
Absolutely, and it's a really good point. When you have depression, when you have mental illness, there isn't really a cure. But what is possible is you can manage it. For some people, it does just go one day, but it's rare. Most of the time, you have the tools, you manage it every day, and you're absolutely right that when you help somebody else with their struggles, you're kind of just reinforcing all the stuff that you do to manage your own struggles. So it goes back to what I was saying before, that all those years where I had no solutions and no techniques to help myself, it's so sad that people out there don't have help, that they have to suffer in silence. They have to suffer because it's hard enough having depression. It's hard enough having anxiety, but at least I've got 1,000 pages worth of material to refer to help myself. I couldn't imagine what it would be like not having access to it. I couldn't.
Yeah, sure. And I'm sure there are, well, we know, I mean, we know what's been going on in this last year. And actually, it does seem to be a lot of, men in their 50s that have possibly never even had any kind of mental health issues up until this point, really, really struggling over these last 18 months. And then possibly the problem there could be because they have never had any kind of experience with that kind of thing. Like you said, they won't know that there is actually help out there because they wouldn't know where to go, right?
So there are two factors that contribute towards why men really struggle with mental illness and why they find it so hard to open up. The first, sometimes it's because they had big father figures. So when you have a father figure that's larger than life, maybe a big achiever, maybe he was, very popular, maybe he was macho and strong and tough. All these kind of things are tough acts to live up to. And I had a dad like that who was revered, highly revered, very tough. He was the quintessential macho man, but just loved by everybody. And he helped everybody. There was no one that he didn't help. And he sorted out everyone's problems. Yeah. So when you have a dad like that, it creates internal struggles because you have to live up to that. You have to follow that. So that's one factor that makes it difficult for men. The other factor is that it can be perceived by a man as weak to open up. Because if they open up and they're vulnerable, they're not being a man. They're not manning up. Right? It's become really popular now, this slogan, man up.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the kind of reasons why men are reluctant. And it's also a case of how they think their mates are going to perceive it. Are their mates going to perceive them as being weak and, small, or how are they going to be perceived? That's what their concern is.
Well, isn't that interesting that, yes, we do, and this is something, I've always sort of taught my girls is, if there was one thing I could, get you to understand that, we put so much importance on what other people think. Oh my goodness, if we could teach any child to understand that, please don't let that affect anything that you do. But it is interesting that you say that, because I would 100% agree. I think everybody goes through life with that fear of what will they think. And it does seem such a shame, a huge shame, because I'm sure it stops people from living as full a life as they could possibly live. And like you're saying, with this is going to have a knock-on effect to how they feel. And when you do take a step back and look at that, just what you just said there, that statement, when you're stepping back and looking in, it sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it? That we put so much importance on that. Why do we do that? Where do you think that comes from? And do you think things are actually changing now?
Well, the root of wanting to compare to others and put others on a pedestal comes from a lack of self-worth and a lack of self-esteem. It's all about your relationship with yourself. So if I feel great about myself, if I am proud of my achievements, if I'm proud of where I am in life, if I'm proud of the person I am, if I like the way I look, I'm not going to look to others and feel a sense of inadequacy, because I'm okay. I'm okay with who I am. Sadly, so many people struggle with those basic things, such as the way they look, the way they come across, scared of judgment, scared of how they're going to fit in, scared of opening up. There are such barriers now, and because social media is the main vehicle of communication now, there is so much pressure that comes with that, especially with teenagers, and especially going, through college and all that kind of age, because there are all these illusions which are portrayed on social media. Someone showing you this great life they have, but you don't get to see what goes on behind closed doors.
No. Yeah.
People feel that they aspire to be someone they're not, and I think that's the root of it. It's trying to be something you're not, and
yeah,
you can come to that point of acceptance that this is who I am, and I actually like who I am. That's a good starting point.
Right, interesting. So it all really does break down into self-image problems. It's how we are viewing ourselves, how we see ourselves. This it's a shame it's not taught in schools. I really do feel that these vital lessons that you're just talking about there, if children were taught this, we'd have far less problems, right?
Yeah, and the other thing is that we are constantly bombarded with this message that we're not enough. There's so much choice of everything out there. So, choice of TV channels and choice of products, and there's too much of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So there's never a point where you can just say, I'm happy with this. There's always this wanting more, wanting something faster, wanting something newer. And it just gives you this kind of feeling of, I can't be happy with what I've got. I need this. It's like,
Yes.
when I get this, or when this happens in my life, then everything will be great. Then I'll be happy. But life doesn't work that way.
No, there's always something else, right? As you said, there's just too many choices. And yet, if we realise that actually you just got to be happy now, being in the now and simply being, it does seem that is, I agree with you. There's too much. We are spoilt for choice, aren't we?
And actually, the whole root of anxiety is based on constantly worrying about what could happen. And that's, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of people around the world now who have anxiety. It's a huge issue. So why do so many people suffer with anxiety? Well, it's because we haven't learned how to just be, So the only moment is now. That's it. The next hour doesn't exist. Obviously the next hour will come around at some point, but right now it's just us talking. That's all that's happening.
Yeah.
And that's why techniques like mindfulness are so useful to tackle mental illness, because what mindfulness does is it puts you in the moment where you can truly appreciate what's going on around you for the reality that it is. So if you're standing in your garden, what can you hear? What can you see? What are all the different sounds you can hear? What are all the different things you can see? What are the things you can smell? And what that does is it trains your brain to just focus on right now, the moment. Because anxiety is not possible, worry is not possible, fear is not possible when you're just being now.
Absolutely. I mean, it is such a powerful thing, and it is something, this is not going to be something that even the listeners haven't heard before. I've heard this thousands of times before, yet it seems so simple, but it seems to be so difficult for some people, because yes, it's again, as an outsider looking in, because I know I get caught up in it myself at times, so I'm no angel or anything, but as an outsider looking in, when you explain it as you just have, again, it seems ridiculous. Why is anybody suffering with anxiety over something that hasn't even happened yet? And there could be thousands of different possibilities of things that could happen in the future, and yet we're wasting precious energy doing actual, if we understood that we're doing so much damage to our body, when you step out and look at that and you think, why would you do that? Yet so many of us do, right? It's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it?
Well, the two ridiculous things about anxiety is that feeling anxious about an outcome that hasn't happened is not going to change the outcome.
No.
Right? And the other thing is that if you made a note of every anxiety you've ever had and back-checked it, 95% of the anxieties you've had have never occurred.
There you go. It's a fascinating subject, because so many go through it, and I'm sure 10 times more in the last 18 months. Interestingly, see, personally, I would say in a conscious state, I'm not an anxious person. However, the truth of that is I do, because there can be at night time, I can jump up, I'm suffering with anxiety in my sleep, which is a huge indication that something's going on there, but more on a subconscious level. So we all, with varying degrees, suffer with this, but I still find the subject so incredibly fascinating that when you look at it logically, it seems like such a silly thing to do. So why are we doing it?
Well, again, there's two things there. So one thing I would say is that with nighttime anxiety, something that might help with that is journaling. So what journaling does is it creates a little bit of space between the thoughts. That's what anxiety is. It's all thought. And what that does is it creates a bit of space between the thoughts and you, because the aim with tackling ruminating thoughts, obsessive thoughts, compulsive thoughts, is you need to become the observer rather than be controlled by them. And for that to happen, you need to create space. So how do you do that? If you write down what your anxieties are, preferably well before bedtime, so that it's not too close to when you're actually going to sleep. The secret then is to reframe them, to try and reframe what your fears are. Everyone has fears. It's how we're made. But it's the reframing part that will help. So reframing of fear, the way that works is, for instance, if you have a fear that this pandemic is never going to end, right? Which is obviously
feels like that sometimes.
It's probably the most common fear right now. So what you could do is you could, write down how that makes you feel. And first thing is to identify what the fear is. So you identify the fear, you write that down, you then talk yourself through how it makes you feel. And then you draw a line and you say, right, how can I reframe this? How can I change my perception? Because when you are up at night and you're lying in bed and you're going through all those ruminating thoughts, those thoughts are based on perceptions. It's how you are, it's how you're viewing things. So it's important to try and change those perceptions. So, for instance, using the example of the pandemic, one thing you could say is that there are countries around the world that have resumed normality, and they are, leading pretty much normal lives. Now, okay, that might not happen tomorrow, but at some point you could say there's a good probability that we're going to follow suit at some point. So that's just one example of how you can just change your perception towards something. What that does is it reconditions your brain. It reconditions how your brain works, which we can do.
Right, because it is, I suppose, at the end of the day, I suppose we've just, some of us, because of obviously what's gone on in the last 18 months, it's just, people have just they've just got themselves caught up in a habit of this story that they're telling themselves. But like any habit, habits can be changed, right? Yeah. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is rigid. If we didn't suffer anxiety as a baby, it is a learned thing. So anything that's learned can be unlearned, or you learn something else. So there's hope, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And one thing I was going to say is that a lot of it comes down to will. It's your will. It's, for instance, I've treated people who have severe depression, and a lot of people can't get out of bed. Right? So what I'll say to them is, well, rather than focus on the entire day, which is what makes someone want to stay in bed, they're thinking about the whole day ahead, and it's too overwhelming. I'll say, well, just focus on getting out of bed first. That's all you need to focus on. So what that does is it takes away that sense of overwhelm. Because going back to what we were saying before about why are people still feeling anxiety when a lot of it is just illusory, it's all thought, is down to will. It's down to sometimes in life, you do have to force yourself to do things you don't want to do. You have to feel uncomfortable. And, it's not easy, but when you're feeling anxiety or when you're feeling depressed, you've got to, it's not a choice, but then you can choose to try and do something that's going to help yourself. Now, that boils down to will. That boils down to digging deep and trying to find that strength to help yourself. Because in the end, you can have an hour of therapy a week, or you can, do this, that, or the other. But, you've got a life to lead. How are you going to spend your days? How are you going to spend your time from when you get up? This is what it boils down to. If I can give you a bunch of tools about what to do when you're feeling low, or when you're feeling powerless, or when you're feeling intense grief, but you've got to apply the tools. You've got to do it.
Yeah, you can take a horse to water, right? You can't make them drink. It's got to come from within, yeah. And it's, I know I don't know. It's a bit like, we all want somebody to come in and save us, but people have got to save themselves, right? But if they don't know the tools, they're not aware, because there's nothing wrong in that, right? Well, none of us are born aware of all this information. Some people just literally are not going to be aware of the tools and things that can help them. But then the tools that you can give them, but they've got to use it, right? So what coping mechanisms and strategies do you use daily to combat depression and anxiety?
Well, as I said, journaling is a biggie. It's one of the main strategies I use. I would say changing your environment is really important. So if you are going through a lot of ruminating thoughts and negative thoughts, you do need to create some physical space. If you are stuck in the same environment, just ruminating, you're just fueling the fire, because those thoughts have got nowhere to go. All they're going to do is go round and round and round in your head. So change your environment, get out the house. That's what I always say. If you can, get out in nature. Now, what getting out in nature does is it physically calms your brain. I'm very lucky. I've got 5 beaches within 20 minutes of where I live.
Oh, jealous.
And if I'm having a really bad day, I will head out there. I don't care what the weather's like. When you stand there and you've got the sound of the waves, you actually feel your brain calming.
Yeah.
Not everyone has access to a beach, but if you can get out where there's some greenery, because when you're in nature, something happens to you physiologically. And it's about changing your body's chemistry. When you move your body, you're changing your physiology. So that's why exercise is fantastic for dealing with mental illness, because you're releasing stressors,
Yeah.
releasing endorphins, and again, it's just having distraction. When you distract your brain, even if it's skipping a rope for 20 minutes, punching a bag, going for a run, going for a swim, you're just distracting the brain. And these are the techniques that count.
Oh, and that is it. Again, it seems so. It's like we forget these things. So, for instance, if anybody's got young children, a baby cries, unless they need something specific, like a nappy change, or they're hungry. Other than that, what do? We try to distract them, and yet, as we grow, so like you say, I suppose. When people are stuck in the same place, you said about them, they're just ruminating the same thoughts. They're caught in that cycle of just repetitive. Yeah, it makes sense. You're absolutely right to distract yourself then. You've got to break that pattern in some way. So, exercise, getting out in nature, but I'm sure a lot of people will totally connect with that and see why that is going to help them, but it's actually, they've got to get up and do it.
Even something like cooking. I mean, the whole thing with cooking is that you have to come up with a recipe, then you got to get to the shop, and then you got to come back, and then you got to cook the meal, and it's something you can share with others. So all these things, it's a positive process, it's distraction, it's good for your body, and it's just a way of investing in yourself. Like, the brain responds to when you show up, for yourself. When you show up for yourself with any kind of activity that's going to help you mentally and physically, the brain is aware. And the more messages you send yourself that, you matter, the more bearable life's going to be. And
Right.
something as simple as just baking or cooking can be a really, really therapeutic. And often we don't talk about these things. We will talk about obvious techniques like mindfulness or like going for a walk and stuff like that. But as I said, even something like cooking can be great.
Yeah. So really, in what you're saying with all of this, I suppose it's to distract you from these repetitive thoughts by just really keeping busy. And that could be anything. I know that, I know there's some people that struggle to sit still and actually read a book. So that might be difficult for some, but like you say, that's brilliant advice to actually, cook. So, there's a whole process in that and different things to think about, like you said. If they're not, I don't know, if it's raining outside and they can't go for a walk or any one of those things. But it seems to me what you're saying is just sort of distract, try and look for other ways or things that are going to give you that you can actually get enjoyment from. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for instance, the last, 50, however long it's been, 18 months, they've been so challenging, especially for students, because they've just been left in the lurch completely and hung out to dry. And it's been so tough for them. So, especially at uni, they've been kind of expected to just get up and get on their laptop and try and motivate themselves to study online. And the lack of support has just been zero. And, they're kind of left thinking, well, how do I get through the day here? And that's something like cooking can take 2 or 3 hours of your time up, because especially if you're in halls or you're in, sharing a house or whatever, and you've got to get through a whole day and try and motivate yourself, and there's no structure, there's no tutoring, there's nothing. How do you fill your day? And that creates a lot of anxiety. So if you find a few things to fill your day up, then that can just make the whole process so much more bearable. Now, hopefully we're coming out of this, but I think that's one of the reasons why youngsters have struggled so much, because
they've had it so tough because like you say, in school they would have had a whole complete structure, a schedule to stick to, and yet they're at home and they're not having the same thing. They're not having the same thing. I do really feel for the kids. So what for you, with what you do, what do your clients typically come to see you for?
So primarily, I'm a bereavement counsellor, so I treat people who have lost a loved one. I also treat people who have depression, have anxiety, and every person's journey is individual. Some people respond well to healing their traumas and going back and revisiting them and then navigating them so that they can move forward. But some like to draw a line under the past and say, the past has happened, I can't undo it, I just want to move forward, and I want techniques that can help me now. So both those approaches are workable. I would say with someone who's just lost a loved one, there are lots of individual challenges that we go through when we're grieving. So for some who've just had a bereavement, there's going to be all those volatile emotions with shock and with denial and with helplessness, with powerlessness, trying to navigate people through that. There are people who have lost a loved one quite some time ago. They haven't processed their grief. So they'll come to me to try and navigate that and try and understand how to process their emotions. There are people who have complicated grief. There are people who have complex grief, which is when unforeseen tragic circumstances have occurred surrounding the loss of a loved one, and just the inability to deal with that trauma. And very often the trauma gets repressed and then brought to the surface many years later. And what happens is that you can get stuck at different points along the grief process. So help with shifting those, becoming unstuck from those difficult emotions. So everyone has individual journeys with grief.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Everyone's different. Every set of circumstances are going to be different. That must be quite a rewarding thing to be able to do, to help somebody go to process the whole thing and come out of it the other side. So for you, I mean, what are the biggest sort of struggles that you are seeing at the moment that are out there?
So I would say that there are two things that are very common right now. First is the inability to grieve when processing a loss. So when I ask somebody, have you allowed yourself to grieve? And very often they'll say, I don't know how. I actually feel nothing. I don't feel anything. So when you begin to unpack that, you then discover about possible dysfunctional relationships with the person they've lost, a lot of past traumas which need to be navigated. So it's the same with somebody who has depression, and when you suggest journaling, they'll say, I'm not feeling anything. There are no feelings. So very often when there are no feelings, there's always something lurking behind that. The other thing that's very common is how isolated people are, whether they're grieving or whether they are struggling with mental illness. The lack of validation, the lack of emotional support from family, from friends, this is really common. People come to me, and I see it all the time. They feel completely and utterly alone in what they're going through.
Yeah, that does seem to be a common thread, doesn't it? And I suppose, again, going back to the view on what's just been going on in the last days, that does seem to be, especially say for the ones that, really have struggled, it very probably is the ones that have been alone throughout this, which is incredibly sad. So really what you're saying is, support, there needs to be support out there, but that is something that you can offer. I mean, do you think there, like you sort of said earlier, you did mention that, that there really isn't, is there a cure for all? Is there a cure for depression or anxiety, or is it more of a ongoing thing to manage?
So there's a lot to unpack in that question, but what I would say just briefly is that going back to whether mental illness is circumstantial, clinical, severe, moderate, some people who will experience a lot of bad luck, I would call it, in their life, and that then triggers them into a depression. If their life turns around and their depression was purely about the things that happened to them, then I would say, well, there's a pretty good chance that, the depression could eradicate, and you'll wake up one day and you won't feel depressed anymore. I would say, sadly, the majority of people I've seen, and certainly in my case, there is no magic wand to wave it away. But I would say it's very manageable. The good news is that there are so many ways to deal with it. I mean, we've only really touched the surface in today's chat. There are a ton of tools and just a lot of different ways of looking at things, which in the end, as I said, changing perceptions towards things is huge with mental illness.
Right. So for anybody listening that is going through a tough time right now, so there is help out there. So David, how can people find you? How could they get in touch with you if they need help?
So my Instagram is at Heal Your Grief, and my website's healyourgrief.co.uk. Everything's on there. I've launched a video course for depression sufferers on there, which you can get. And I offer a first counselling session for free, just to see if it's something that you want, something that you want to pursue, and to see if therapy is something that you want to take. And everything's on my website or my Instagram.
Fantastic. Okay, so the listeners, if you go to the site, you will have all of, there will be the link for getting in touch with David. And if you're watching on our other platforms, again, David's bio will be underneath and his details underneath too. So, well, thank you very much for your time, David. I can totally understand that this kind of thing is more than needed, and it is interesting what you say. It's so much easier when you do have the tools that you can use. Myself personally, I've just very recently lost my own father, and I'm grateful that I do have the understanding and that it is a process. And I myself am going through the process. You know what? Sometimes I'm fine, the next minute I'm not. And it's just understanding to also know how to ride the waves, because it's not going to be a cut. It's all over as much as we would love it to. It is never going to be like that, right? But I know, and again, I've had personal, 11 years ago, I would say, and for somebody who I would admit before that time, I was very much of a deal with it kind of person, didn't understand this because I had never personally dealt with, never had depression or anxiety until that moment. And I would say I was in a very dark place actually for a couple of years. It hit me very hard, and it was the first real understanding of what this whole, why can't I snap out of this? Because, when you're down there, deal with it is not working. It's really not doing its thing. So I do now have very much an understanding of all of this, and I'm very grateful that I have gone through it, come through it, and learned about it. So if anybody is suffering out there, please reach for David, because there is help, there is hope, and this is really what this show is all about. You know, it is a cup of positivity with a sprinkling of woo-woo. I know it might not have been too much on the woo-woo this week, but it definitely, the mental definitely has a knock-on to the physical. So I would put you actually in both those categories. David, I think people are having the understanding now that the connection between the mind and the body is going to manifest through the body. So I think the message is really that, you know, there's, and like you say, many men feel that, you know, it's weak of them to ask for help. There's no shame in asking for help. We all, every single one of us, no matter how strong a person thinks they are, we all need support, and there is no shame in asking for help. So if anybody is suffering out there, please reach out to him. That is what he's there to do, is to help you navigate through the process. So thank you, David, for your time. And thank you, listeners. I hope you took that there was something for you to take away from today. And I will be back next Monday with a Coffee with Karen. Thank you. Goodbye.
Welcome to the Coffee with Karen podcast, a weekly chat show discussing everything from holistic health to current affairs from a mental, physical and spiritual perspective. Get your weekly cup of positivity with a sprinkling of woo-woo.